UPS plane crash in Kentucky. At least 12 people are now confirmed dead. Engines came off the plane moments before it crashed.
UPS plane crash.
UPS plane crash.
The UPS plane crash.
UPS plane crash in Kentucky. The death toll has now climbed to at least 12.
On the afternoon of November 4th, 2025, the cargo jet carrying the designation UPS Flight 2976 departed from Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport, SDF, in Kentucky.
Plane crash at Muhammad Ali Airport in Louisville, Kentucky.
Bound for Daniel K. Inouye International Airport, HNL, in Honolulu, Hawaii. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11F, tail number N259UP, was operating for UPS Airlines, and it carried 3 crew members on board and no passengers. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Shortly after initiating its takeoff roll, the aircraft suffered a catastrophic failure. Its left engine detached from the wing during acceleration. Videos taken from CCTV and bystanders confirmed the engine separated while the jet was still accelerating on the runway, and the left wing subsequently caught fire. As the aircraft lifted off, it began a sharp bank to the left, lost altitude, and crashed into an industrial area just beyond the airport perimeter. The impact zone included a warehouse of UPS supply chain, a petroleum recycling facility, and an auto scrap yard, causing buildings to ignite and debris to scatter over approximately half a mile. In total, 14 people lost their lives, 3 crew on board and 11 on the ground, and more than 15 were injured. From the opening seconds of the investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, began coordinating the probe, launching a GO team of 28 investigators to the scene. The day had been unremarkable in terms of weather. Clear visibility, light winds, dry runway. Nothing in the weather appeared to be a contributing factor. The aircraft began its takeoff roll down runway 17R/35L at approximately 5:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As pilots advance to takeoff thrust, an aircraft commits to flight if past the V1 speed, essentially meaning rejection of the takeoff may no longer be safe. For this flight, as the left engine detached during the roll, the aircraft nonetheless lifted off, attaining an altitude of about 175 feet above ground and a ground speed near 186 knots before the bank and descent began. The separation of the engine, detected both on the flight data and witness footage, was followed almost immediately by fire on the left wing. The video analysis suggests flames spouted from the tail-mounted engine as well, likely triggered by high-velocity debris from the separated engine. Within seconds of liftoff, the aircraft's control was compromised. It began banking left, losing altitude quickly, and impacted the roof of a warehouse of UPS supply chain, carving a 90-meter gash. The left wing then struck fuel tanks at the nearby Kentucky Petroleum Recycling site, triggering a large fireball and causing the aircraft to roll more than 90 degrees, then crash into a semi-truck parking area in the Grade A auto parts scrap yard, landing gear still extended. The detachment of an engine in flight is rare on transport aircraft, but when it happens, it presents a cascade of failures. The loss of thrust, disruption of aerodynamics, damage to control systems or fuel lines, possible fuel leak and fire, and immediate challenge of controlling the aircraft under degraded state. Investigators immediately pointed to the engine and its pylon attachment structure as key to the accident sequence. The aircraft was a 34-year-old MD-11F, serial number 48417, originally delivered to Thai Airways in 1991, later converted to a freighter, and acquired by UPS in 2006. It was powered by 3 General Electric CF680C2D1F engines. Notably, 2 months before the crash, the airplane had been grounded for 6 weeks for repair of a cracked fuel tank, and corrosion was later discovered along 2 structural beams in the fuselage. The crew consisted of a seasoned team: Captain Richard Wartenberg, 57, a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, First Officer Lee Truitt, 45, and Relief Captain Dana Diamond, 62. While cargo flights generally operate without passengers, the dynamics of a heavy fuel load, as this flight was headed to Hawaii, mean that the aircraft was well loaded in terms of weight and fuel. The heavy fuel load contributes to performance requirements for takeoff and climb, and any damage within that regime can reduce margins significantly. Indeed, the aircraft reportedly carried approximately 38,000 gallons, approximately 220,000 lbs of fuel at departure. When the aircraft crashed, it was not within the secured confines of the runway end. Instead, it impacted an industrial zone adjoining the airport. The burning wreckage led to massive fires, thick plumes of smoke, destruction of industrial buildings, and posed serious risk to ground personnel and nearby residents. Local emergency management issued a shelter-in-place order for a 5-mile radius around the airport, telling residents to shut off air handling systems to reduce inhalation of smoke and potentially hazardous fumes. More than 100 firefighters and rescue personnel were deployed. The fire was nearly contained by late evening, enabling search and recovery operations across the debris field. Meanwhile, families were asked not to rush to hospitals, but to a designated reunification center as many victims and missing persons were expected. The crash caused immediate airport disruption. Flights were canceled, the adjacent runway closed, and UPS suspended operations at its Worldport hub temporarily. Schools in the local district closed the following day. The scale of damage on the ground was considerable. Satellite imagery showed a gash of some 295 feet in a warehouse roof. Widespread debris scattered over half a mile and several businesses affected. Tragically, all 3 crew members aboard perished. On the ground, 11 more fatalities were confirmed, making this the deadliest accident in UPS Airlines history. 15 families initially reported missing relatives. By November 6th, the Louisville mayor reported 6 had been accounted for, leaving 9 still missing at that point. Beyond the fatalities, the human toll includes trauma to survivors, damage to businesses, the uprooting of local lives, and the psychological impact on first responders. The scene of devastation, smoke, and fire made recovery efforts difficult and emotionally wrenching. The investigation is ongoing, led by the NTSB, with assistance from the FAA and other agencies. The NTSB recovered both the cockpit voice recorder CVR and flight data recorder FDR. One key finding from the cockpit voice recorder: a repeating warning bell sounded just 37 seconds after takeoff thrust was applied. That bell persisted until the crash some 25 seconds later. Investigators interpret this continuous warning as a sign of a major system failure, and the crew can be heard working to try to regain control of the aircraft. The left engine separation remains a focal point. According to NTSB officials, the engine detached during the takeoff roll, not after liftoff, and the separation led to critical failure conditions. In addition to the engine and pylon failure, investigators are examining the aircraft's maintenance history, including the recent fuel tank repair and structural corrosion discovered in the fuselage beams, to determine if those had any bearing on the integrity of the aircraft at that moment. Because the aircraft was laden with a heavy fuel load, the consequences of damage in the takeoff phase were magnified. The loss of thrust and subsequent fire would have reduced performance margins extremely rapidly, leaving little time and altitude for the crew to recover. The end of takeoff phase is one of the most critical in flight operations, and aircraft are operating near maximum performance limits. In the wake of the crash, the FAA issued an Emergency Airworthiness Directive EAD grounding all MD-11 and MD-11F aircraft until further inspection and corrective actions could be taken. Aircraft type-specific airworthiness directives are rare but signify the seriousness of this event. Both UPS and its competitor FedEx temporarily grounded their fleets of MD-11s. The grounding had immediate ripple effects on overnight cargo operations, especially at major hubs Memphis, Dallas-Fort Worth, Ontario, and raised concerns about supply chain delays ahead of the holiday season. Legal action has already begun. Plaintiffs and law firms have filed lawsuits against UPS, the aircraft manufacturer Boeing, which inherited the MD-11 design through McDonnell Douglas, and engine maker General Electric GE. Allegations include negligence, design defects, failure to inspect or maintain the engine pylon structure, and responsibility for the damage caused on the ground. In the local community, the tragedy triggered vigils, moments of silence, and a visible acknowledgement of the scale of the event. The Big Four Bridge across the Ohio River was lit up in yellow UPS's company color in solidarity. When a transport aircraft's engine detaches in flight or during takeoff, there are very few success stories. The precedent of American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979, a DC-10 which lost its left engine and crashed, looms large in the industry's collective memory. The MD-11 shares many structural and aerodynamic lineages with the DC-10. Investigators will therefore examine not only the specific mechanical failure, but also the larger system, maintenance practices, the fatigue life of components, the inspection regimes for older aircraft, the adequacy of design mitigation for engine pylon separation, and the human-machine interface in emergency situations. Furthermore, the accident highlights how aircraft accidents can have major consequences on the ground. Most major airline disasters involve passengers and crew. Here, the presence of an industrial zone near the airport meant ground casualties were significant, which further complicates the response and regulatory environment. The role of heavy fuel loads in cargo operations also comes under scrutiny. More fuel means more weight, more risk, and a greater fire load on impact. The proximity of hazardous facilities, fuel tank yards, recycling plants to busy aircraft movement zones will also be assessed by regulators and urban planners. Determining what happened in the final seconds can seem almost academic against the human cost, but in aviation safety, the value lies in preventing the next one. From the timeline, investigation, and early data, a plausible chain of events emerges. During takeoff roll, the left engine separated. High-velocity fragments may have caused collateral damage, perhaps to the tail engine or wing structure. The aircraft rotated, lifted off partially, but was now in a pathological state. Loss of thrust and wing fire caused a bank and descent that could not be arrested. The aircraft impacted terrain in an industrial zone with catastrophic results. Yet each of those links must be verified. Why did the engine detach? Was it structural fatigue? Manufacturing defect? Improper maintenance? Or load beyond design? Did the pylon fail on its own? Or was it damaged earlier? Was there a latent crack, corrosion, or maintenance oversight? Did the fire on the left wing occur because of fuel leak or from engine debris damage? Did the crew have sufficient altitude and systems functioning to attempt a return or abort? What were the performance margins at the time given the fuel load and weight? The NTSB cautions against speculation, but the data recovered thus far, engine separation, fire, low altitude, abrupt bank crash, points very strongly to a catastrophic sequence triggered during the takeoff roll with no time or altitude for recovery. The bell sounded in the cockpit at 37 seconds after takeoff thrust was applied, gives a precise chronological marker of when things went wrong. For the city of Louisville and the broader region, the crash is a tragedy layered into a busy logistical hub. UPS's Worldport facility at Louisville is among the largest air freight hubs in the world. The crash led to an immediate suspension of some operations, and the grounding of the MD-11 fleet had knock-on effects for overnight express shipments and supply chain logistics ahead of the busiest season of the year. Community recovery involves not only rebuilding structures and cleaning a debris field, but also addressing the psychological trauma felt by residents, first responders, business owners whose properties were destroyed, and families of the victims. The fact that some victims were ground-based, employees, or visitors in the industrial zone adds complexity to the memorial and legal processes. For UPS, the reputational and operational oversight is significant. While cargo airlines do not carry the same passenger image risks, a large accident with ground casualties brings intense regulatory and public relations scrutiny. The decision to ground the MD-11 fleet voluntarily and via the FAA directive represents a precautionary stance, but also acknowledges the gravity of the event. The legal actions already in motion highlight how the industry must now examine whether age, maintenance, design, and operation of these older aircraft were sufficiently rigorous. From the evidence publicly released, significant facts are clear. The aircraft type, the operator, the flight path, the time and place of the accident, the engine detachment, the fire on the wing, the deaths and damage on the ground. The investigative data from the CVR and FDR are secured. The NTSB has stipulated that the transcript of the cockpit voice recorder will be made public only after a majority of the factual reports are placed in the public docket. What remains to be determined includes the precise root causes of the engine separation, the sequence of systems failures following that event, whether the crew had systems or configuration that complied with emergency procedures, what role the aircraft's maintenance history or age may have played, and whether airport environmental or infrastructural factors, proximity of recycling plants, fuel tank yards contributed to the severity of the ground damage. The NTSB's final report will also make safety recommendations to the FAA, to aircraft manufacturers, to airlines, and to airport operators and zoning authorities. Those recommendations will carry real weight. They may lead to mandatory inspection regimes, structural retrofits, operational restrictions on aging freighters, or new rules about industrial zoning near aircraft movement areas. This accident brings into sharp relief that cargo aviation, though often out of the public eye compared to passenger aviation, carries significant risk. The vast majority of flights of cargo jets operate without incident, but when something catastrophic happens, the consequences are just as grave. In particular, this event underscores how takeoff remains one of the most critical phases of flight. High thrust, high speed, high energy, limited altitude. Any structural failure, engine failure, fire, or control anomaly at that moment rapidly reduces the margin for recovery. Moreover, the age of the aircraft is a factor in many cargo fleets. The MD-11 is no longer manufactured, and many such airframes have been in service for decades. The maintenance and inspection regimes for older aircraft must be meticulously maintained. While regulators require this, accidents still bring up questions of whether old equals safe if maintained, or whether age introduces latent risks that manifest under adverse conditions. The interplay between aircraft and the ground environment is critical. The crash site included industrial facilities with fuel tanks and scrap yards. The destructive path of the aircraft combined with the presence of additional combustibles amplified damage and casualties. Airport planners, regulatory transport officials, and urban developers may now revisit how close industrial zoning can be to flight paths and runway ends. In the hours after the crash, the Louisville community found itself in the direct path of disaster. Residents sat under shelter orders. Firefighters battled infernos. Businesses lost inventory and buildings. Families waited for word. For UPS employees and contractors, the hub that separates packages by the millions every night became the center of a tragedy. For aviation professionals, the accident is a grim reminder that every flight carries risk, even when conditions seem routine. For the crew of Flight 2976, the day had started like any other. Warm-up, checklist, clearance, deep breath. In a matter of seconds, the scenario changed irrevocably. The investigation will show exactly how and why, but the human dimension remains. Lives lost, families impacted, business disrupted, regulations tightened. The lessons learned will ripple through the industry. As the investigation continues, we can expect a timeline of findings. The NTSB will release a preliminary report in about 30 days, followed by a full final report months later. In the meantime, airlines operating older aircraft, particularly MD-11S and similar Tragically, will be reviewing maintenance logs, structural records, engine pylon inspections, and operational procedures for takeoff in heavy fuel conditions. The FAA will likely issue further directives informed by the findings. Airport authorities and adjacent industrial facility managers will consider whether operational zones pose added risk for ground casualties. For the public, the crash is a sobering reminder of the complexity and the stakes of modern air transport. Even as we place trust in systems, aircraft, crews, and regulators, tragedies remain possible, and everyone demands scrutiny so that the next flight is safer. The investigation into the crash of UPS Flight 2976 continues to unfold, with investigators piecing together data from multiple sources to form an increasingly detailed picture of what transpired and why. On the surface, the accident was dramatic. An MD-11 freighter lifting off from Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport in Kentucky on November 4, 2025, suffered a catastrophic failure during its takeoff roll. Its left engine separating, fire erupting, and the aircraft plunging into an industrial zone. Yet beneath that simplified sequence lies layers of technical, operational, organizational, and regulatory complexity, all of which will shape the final findings and subsequent responses. The audio captured a distinct sequence. Shortly after the call for takeoff thrust, the cockpit voice recorder recorded a single warning bell that began approximately 37 seconds later and continued until the end of the flight. The meaning of that bell remains the subject of investigation. At this stage, the NTSB has not definitively stated whether it was an engine fire warning, a system malfunction alert, or a fault triggered by structural damage. But they view it as a clear marker of when the crew became aware that something had gone seriously wrong. The engine separation remains central. According to NTSB preliminary information and witness video footage, the left engine, the number 1 engine, detached from the wing during the takeoff roll, before the aircraft became airborne. The detached engine was later found beside the runway. Investigators examined not only the physical failure of the engine and pylon attachment, but also how pieces of the engine casing or internal components may have caused further damage when the engine separated. For example, by puncturing fuel or hydraulic lines, severing wiring, or damaging wing structure or control surfaces. Such cascade effects can rapidly degrade an aircraft's ability to fly or maneuver. Given the engine separation, attention has turned to maintenance and inspection history of the aircraft. The MD-11 involved tail number N259UP was 34 years old and had undergone maintenance in the weeks and months before the accident. It had been grounded for approximately 6 weeks for a cracked fuel tank repair, and later corrosion was discovered in 2 structural beams of the fuselage. While the fuel tank repair isn't necessarily linked to the engine and pylon failure, it raises questions about the overall airworthiness oversight of older freighter aircraft operating in demanding environments. Investigators will be looking to see if fatigue, corrosion, improper repair, or inspection lapses could have contributed to the pylon separation. Operational context also plays a role. The flight was a cargo leg from Louisville to Honolulu, a long-haul route requiring a heavy fuel load to cross the continent and over the Pacific. Analysts estimate the aircraft departed with around 38,000 gallons of fuel, or over 200,000 pounds, to accommodate range and reserve. Heavy fuel weight increases the demands on takeoff performance and reduces margin for error. Any degradation of thrust, lift, control, or structural integrity has less buffer. From takeoff roll onward, the aircraft must accelerate, rotate, lift off, and climb rapidly. Losing an engine or experiencing structural damage at that critical juncture leaves very little time for recovery. The crash site analysis also reveals how multiple factors converge to maximize the damage. After liftoff, video shows the left wing alight and the aircraft banking left. Debris struck nearby fuel tanks at the adjacent petroleum recycling facility, triggering explosions and transforming a bad situation into a catastrophic one. The location of industrial facilities, the large volume of fuel on board, the falling engine and debris, and the high energy state of the aircraft all contributed to the scale of the disaster. Satellite images show a 295-foot-long gash in a warehouse roof and a debris field extending half a mile. Beyond the technical and operational issues, the human factor and situational awareness of the crew are under scrutiny. The CVR transcript will reveal how the pilots responded when the alarm bell began, what checklists they attempted, whether the decision to continue the takeoff rather than abort was made in accordance with procedures, and whether they had sufficient altitude and airspeed to effect an emergency return. Some of these questions hinge on whether the critical failure occurred prior to or after decision speeds V1, VR, and whether the crew's performance was affected by workload or degraded systems. As part of this, investigators will examine the takeoff roll, the ambient conditions, pilot inputs, system warnings, aircraft weight and balance, and whether the performance margins aligned with the regulatory requirements and the operator's standard operating procedures, SOPs. Weather was reported normal, light winds, good visibility, dry runway. So environmental factors appear unlikely to have contributed significantly. At the regulatory level, the responses have been swift. The Federal Aviation Administration FAA issued an Emergency Airworthiness Directive EAD requiring grounding of all MD-11 and MD-11F aircraft until inspections and corrective actions are completed. Moreover, investigations extended to similar aircraft types, including earlier models such as the DC-10, because of analogous engine pylon separation risks. Boeing, which inherited the MD-11 design from McDonnell Douglas, recommended voluntary grounding of its operators' fleets while engineering reviews are underway. From a legal and financial standpoint, the crash has launched an array of lawsuits. Local businesses whose property was damaged are filing negligence and product liability claims against UPS, the engine manufacturer GE, and Boeing McDonnell Douglas. One law firm described the event as acting like a bomb, given the wide damage radius and ground fatalities. These claims will examine maintenance records, design standards, inspection intervals, and whether operators or manufacturers failed to anticipate or guard against the specific failure mode. Another dimension is the impact on the cargo logistics ecosystem. The sudden grounding of the MD-11 fleet disrupted overnight freight operations in the U.S., especially for time-sensitive deliveries and global supply chains. Airports such as Memphis, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Ontario experienced ripple effects as carriers scrambled to substitute aircraft types and redirect cargo loads. While the MD-11 constitutes a small percentage of some fleets for UPS, around 9%, its removal forced rerouting, rescheduling, and additional cost burdens across the logistics network. At the local level, the Louisville community is contending with the aftermath. The crash forced shelter-in-place orders, school closures, evacuation of nearby industrial workers, and extensive damage to businesses, including a petroleum recycling facility and an auto scrapyard. Emergency services responded en masse, and the cleanup and investigation phases extend for weeks. Residents reported debris, smoke hazards, and anxiety about industrial zoning near the airport. The proximity of heavy industry to the runway end, while long tolerated, is now under renewed scrutiny. Moving forward, one of the key outcomes will be the NTSB's final report, which is typically released many months after the event and may take up to 2 years in complex cases. The report will present a probable cause statement, contributing factors, and safety recommendations. These recommendations could include enhanced inspection requirements for engine pylon attachments, modifications of maintenance programs for aging freighters, structural integrity checks for long-in-service aircraft, revised SOPs for heavy fuel takeoffs, and airport zoning reviews for ground risk mitigation. In addition, the event is spurring industry-wide reflection. Aging aircraft, especially freighters converted from passenger versions, require deeper scrutiny due to the accumulation of cycles and structural stress. Engine pylon separation is a known albeit rare failure mode, especially when debris from an uncontained engine failure can damage adjacent systems. This accident reinforces that risk. Industry commentators draw parallels with another tragic event, American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979, which also involved a DC-10 losing its left engine at takeoff and crashing. The human dimension cannot be understated. 3 pilots lost their lives, their families and colleagues left to grieve. On the ground, 11 people died. Their names and stories are surfacing slowly, along with the physical and emotional loss to the community. For first responders and investigators, the scene was one of devastation and trauma. For residents, the crash has raised questions about proximity of industrial operations to flight paths, emergency response readiness, and awareness of the latent risks that helicopters, freighters, and industry can pose when things go wrong. The recovery of the scene is also instructive. Investigators had to map a half-mile debris field, sift through fire-damaged materials, determine where engine pieces landed, and recover the aircraft's records and major components. The fire complicated the process, turning metal into char and reducing many parts to molten fragments. Still, investigators have been able to trace trajectories of engine separation, estimate rotation of the aircraft after liftoff or partial liftoff, and model the load environment at the moment of failure. The ADS-B automatic dependent surveillance broadcast data provides snapshots of altitude and ground speed. For example, the last ADS-B message indicated an altitude of approximately 475 feet above sea level, around 100 feet above ground at about 186 knots ground speed. Analyses are focusing on whether the crew could have aborted the takeoff. In modern commercial operations, once the aircraft passes V1, the decision speed, the pilot must continue the takeoff even if major failures occur. Provided the aircraft can become airborne and climb, investigators will calculate whether V1 had been passed, whether the loss of an engine and damage to wing systems allowed the aircraft to meet climb gradient requirements, and whether the pilot had a realistic alternative path. For example, rejecting and braking along the remaining runway. Given the heavy fuel load, full takeoff thrust, and separation of the engine prior to or during rotation, the scenario may have left no viable recovery path. An important factor is the role of crew training and operational procedures. Cargo crews may face different pressures than passenger flights. Tighter schedules, older airframes, heavy fuel departures, and fewer redundancies in their operations. Investigators will examine whether UPS's training, oversight, fatigue management, maintenance scheduling, and decision-making culture met the necessary standard, and whether the organizational structure supported the safe operation of an older fleet type on long-haul missions. Simultaneously, airport layout and land use issues are under reassessment. The crash site overlapped industrial zones located just beyond the runway end. The proximity of the petroleum recycling facility with fuel tanks, an auto scrap yard, and other flammable materials increased the severity of the accident. The presence of hazardous materials near high-energy flight zones complicates the ground risk profile. Planning authorities and airports will likely review whether to impose greater buffer zones or limit certain industrial uses near runways. From a public safety and regulatory perspective, the crash underscores that aircraft accidents are not only about airborne failures. The ground environment, fuel loads, structure, and systems all matter. Regulators may put new emphasis on takeoff phase vulnerability, defined as the period of highest energy, lowest altitude, and minimal time to recover. Operating heavy fuel flights over industrial zones right after takeoff may face scrutiny. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on UPS Flight 2976 crash and what outcomes you expect? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.